Do we have too much government?
We need to put people ahead of corporate profits.
This system is so lopsided. This threat is a real threat to democracy.
And I think that's really important. That's something we haven't been doing in this country for a long time.
Where do you start? What do you do? How do you do it?
Access to Democracy and other Eagan community television programming is supported by Thomson Reuters, makers of Westlaw Next and based in Eagan. Through Westlaw Next and other innovative online services, Thomson Reuters is the world's leading source of intelligent information for businesses and professionals. Online at thomsonreuters.com. And by U.S. Federal Credit Union, the member-owned financial institution offering service, value, and experience you can trust to the greater Twin Cities community.
And welcome to Access to Democracy. Believe it or not, this is the second Access to Democracy we have done today with the same guest, because here in our beautiful studios at Thomson Reuters, with all our new state-of-the-art equipment, retired Justice Paul Anderson, one of our favorite guests, was here a half an hour ago, and we started and proceeded with the interview, and suddenly the equipment failed.
Well, see, that's how retired justices get treated. You know, you can become a non-entity, and you know the sound just goes out, and you are kind of just passé. Actually, we had fun. We got to remember now what we said the first time.
That is a first, though. Well, I was talking about the fact that in this winter of all winters that we're having, and we're getting belted with snow outside, you, notwithstanding that, showed up here and you had a fire in your home this morning. So let's talk about that.
Well, I just want to talk about that a little bit. Is that, you know, retired, I need to have a place to work. I'm redoing the basement into a home office, right up to the close to the finishing. They're putting the carpet in today. But a very freak accident happened. As they were putting the glue down, the workman's tape measure, which is aluminum, touched the padding, which had a static electricity, which ignited the fumes, and there was a big explosion of flame. You know, the workman had his fire extinguisher there, but it had been in the truck overnight. It was frozen, so he yells, "Fire, fire!" And here's the key thing that everybody listening to the show should pay attention to. We had fire extinguishers in the house, and we knew where they were. So both my wife and I ran to the closet where it was, pulled it out, went down, and very quickly put the fire out. It was a big fire, but it was confined, and so I'm glad to be here. But for your guests, check, well, one, if you don't have a fire extinguisher, get one, because it can happen to you. It happened to me. And then know where it is. I mean, the worst thing you do is have it there.
And make sure that it's in working
condition.
Yes,
you got to check the pressure. Yeah.
Right. Periodically. And for the judge's insurance company, which is listening in, there was a lot of smoke damage.
No,
so
there's not that much smoke.
You'll be hearing from us.
I opened up the windows. And of course, I have a very poor smeller. My wife might have a different opinion.
So, in any event, it's been several months now. You're retired. In fact, we've had your successor on just a few weeks ago.
Yeah, he's doing pretty well, I think.
Judge Lillehag, who's always a favorite guest when he was here also in private practice, and certainly with some great cases that he handled. But I find that you are over at the legislature now, and you're testifying about certain things.
Not because I really particularly want to be there, and I a little higher profile than I want, but there are a couple of issues that I have some background on. One, I was over there on talking about expungement. When I left the court, I wrote 2 very strong dissents on cases dealing with expungement. I think that society needs to be willing to expunge records when somebody has paid their penalty, and there's been a reasonable period of waiting. And but I was on the losing side on the court, but those dissents carried some impetus over to the legislature. And so there are a number of pieces of legislation on expungement and how to go about it, how society is going to forgive people who have committed an offense. And so I was asked to come and explain just my view. And bottom line, I told them, is that, I mean, the majority, while I disagreed with it, was not an unprincipled position. And the message the legislature needs to take from those opinions, even though I disagreed with them, is that it's the legislature that's going to have to do something if society's going to do something. And the courts will not bail them out, will not, is going to construe everything narrowly, so it's the legislature's job to do something.
People have served their sentence, they've done their time, in some cases rehabilitated, but we don't do a very good job of rehabilitating people in prison.
Better than you'd think sometimes, but still we don't do as much as we could.
Absolutely, and we have more people in prison in this country than any other country in the world. It's really well over 2 million people who are locked up, sometimes for really, really minimal offenses, and we were talking
now,
about
I
cocaine.
have some good news to report on that state, is that Minnesota is, I think, the second lowest state in number of people in prison. But we are very high in the ranking in number of people who are under state supervision because of criminal offenses. That's because we have a tradition of community corrections in the state, and we try to do probation or whatever. So I mean, Minnesota is not lenient on catching and prosecuting crime, but we are careful as to who we put into prison.
We could call it the second chance, really.
Yeah, but if there's an exception in that area, and I was just doing a presentation on sentencing guidelines last night, it's related to our drug offenses and how we treat drug offenses. We have decided we are going to determine the status of an individual with drugs based on quantity. And quantity determines whether the law treats them as a seller or a user. The problem is the quantity is set so low. We have a number of users, not malevolent people, but people are addicted, getting into that category where they face the harsh penalties that should be reserved to the bad guys, the really bad guys, the kingpins. And so what we have is that a number of people who are ignorant, disabled, stupid, getting the harsh penalties that should be for the sellers, and they're winding up in prison.
And disproportionately, Caucasians are less apt to be sentenced to prison than are minorities, African Americans, things like that. That's something that we really should address. And in a country that really stands for so much, and yet we have so many prejudices that are working against minorities in this country that it really it's particularly disturbing to me, more now than ever.
I just saw those statistics last night, and from the sentencing guideline people, and they said it still is an existing problem in Minnesota. In many places, if you're Caucasian, you're likely to get a less harsh sentence than if you're African American. But there's another thing that the way the system is working, and it's these smaller offenses which accumulate to be a criminal history score. If you're African American, you're more likely to be arrested, detained, and charged for a minor offense. But that builds up your criminal history score so that by the time you get 4 or 5 or 6 of these and you have another offense, you're spending a long time in prison based upon criminal history score for minor offenses.
And also, I don't think we're doing a good job in terms of voting. If someone is sentenced and someone has done their time and someone gets out of jail, why should we take away their right to vote and to participate in our society? And unfortunately, that's happened all too often in many of our states.
Yeah, and it's, you know, I come from the judiciary, but this is not an issue for the judiciary. This is an issue for society as a whole. They got to decide at what point are they going to forgive and move on. And I think that, forgiving in the sense of saying now you have paid the price, paid the penalty, you can vote again, is a major step along the line of rehabilitation.
I think so, also, and I hope that we can get that message to some legislatures, although as I look at legislatures around the country, I wonder really if it's possible in these very partisan times.
You are referring to a legislature like they had in Arizona, where it's interesting there, the
1062, which got vetoed by...
the governor vetoed it, public pressure.
Right.
And it was an interesting thing. I think it was the economics as much as anything. They saw that Arizona would suffer economically. They ran the risk of losing the Super Bowl in 2016. And so, but it's hard to understand sometimes the irrational acts that a legislature will do. 3 of the legislators who vote for it, asked her to veto it.
Yep. After the fact, after they saw what they did.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, they were quick to say, let's do this, and just add another prejudice against people that's unconstitutional in the first place.
But what we loop back to on this discussion, where we digress a little bit, is that we have a system of separation of powers in the United States, executive, legislative, and judicial. It really does matter who you put in those positions, in each of them, giving them sovereign power, because they have direct impact on your life and others' life and the nature and tenor of our society and our culture. So, we have, our founders marveled, we have an institutionalized system of revolution. Every 2 years we can revolt. We don't have to go to the streets like they do in Britain.
But unfortunately, people are getting less and less informed. People are not reading newspapers. People are relying on sound bites. Social media has taken over intellect in large degrees, and we're interested in the prurient more than the things that really keep this country functioning.
Less bothered, I think, than you are. I think you identify some problems, but I tend to be the glasses 3/4 full type person, and I think we're getting a population that's starting to care a bit more and get involved, because, and it's very interesting. It's, the type of people are getting involved on environmental issues. It's more and more across the ideological line. And so, yes, as you know, I'm not a big fan of Fox News, because I think they don't, you don't get to choose your facts,
As Jon Stewart says, Fox noise.
Yeah, but there are the alternative sources out there, and we just got to understand that they're there, and we need to use them.
Now, back to Paul Anderson. Paul Anderson was very involved in the Capitol restoration. I think you're on the committee.
Yeah. I was up until I left the court, yep.
And a very controversial Senate office building. Not controversial for me, but certainly the subject of even a lawsuit about whether the Senate should have a new office building. So,
this is a very interesting question about how government works, and I'm reminded about what Chancellor Otto von Bismarck once said: if you like law and you like sausage, you shouldn't watch either of them being made. And this whole legislative office, Senate office building, it's sometimes you look at it, it looks like sausage is being made. The question is how the bill was put forward, and I was at a hearing yesterday, and they basically agreed to disagree as to who knew what when. But here's what's going on here. We have one of the most wonderful capitals in the United States. And I mentioned yesterday, I was kind of having a little fun with some of the members of the committee. I said, I'm here because of the fact that I'm an Eisenhower Republican, and I quoted the John Prine song about my grandfather's a carpenter. He builds schools, houses, churches. He levels doors on the level, smoked 2 packs of Camel a day, and he voted Eisenhower because Lincoln won the war. Well, my family members came here in 1858. In the history of Minnesota,
Which just happens to be the year that Minnesota joined
Oh, yeah.
the
Yeah.
United States.
Actually, they were here 2 years before that. But the fact is that they were Lincoln Republicans. If you were from the North, you believed in Lincoln, you believed in his vision, you believed what he wanted to have happen after the war. And it was that generation, which, by the way, the Capitol celebrates as the United States' greatest generation. They thought they were the greatest generation. Brokaw thinks it's World War II. But I was telling the committee is that, and I was tweaking my Democratic friends a little bit, I said, you know, the vision for this Capitol came from Lincoln Republicans. That's why I'm here. I am a surrogate for my great-grandfather, my grandfather, and those who had the vision back then to build this marvelous building for the state of Minnesota.
And unfortunately, it's crumbling.
Yes, and it has to be preserved and restored, but here's where it's the linking to the state office building. You have all of the majority senators in there. They're in rabbit warrens. They're spread all over the building. To properly restore that building and to have the vision and keep it what Cass Gilbert intended it to be, the people's building. That is a place where the people are supposed to go and feel welcome and have spaces where they can go and they can be educated, is that you can't keep all the senators in the Capitol anymore. And so you have to have a place for them.
It's called legislative pollution when you have all the senators in the Capitol.
Well, I mean, so that's why the state office building and the Capitol restoration are linked. Now, I think there are too many senators wanting to stay in the Capitol, but hey, that will be a problem that's solved over a period of time, because once you have the state office. But there's something else that's going on about this state office building. If you ever gone to the Capitol and wanted to park, it's hard to find a place to park.
Almost impossible.
It's given, if you were one of your senators, as a majority senator, it's almost impossible to find out where their office is. And both parties have been stressing accountability and access to the public to their elected representatives. This new building, maybe some of the senators, once they find out how accessible they are to their constituents, won't think it's such a good idea, but it's going to provide better parking, better handicapped access, and better spaces for the public to come and participate in hearings. And there's one other thing that I got to say here.
Which is?
Steve Jobs and the concept of consilience and the motion picture company Pixar. Jobs took over Pixar when it was in the tubes. That is a fabulously successful company. Each of their films has earned over $500 million worldwide. When he designed the facilities for Pixar, he took over a corporate facility, had 3 separate buildings. He tore them down and said, no, we're going to build a building that has a space for administration, technology, and artistic. We're going to build the building so they have to interact. They have to deal with each other. They have to come in contact with each other. One of the things this new building will force Democrats and Republicans to interact with each other, not only with their constituents, but they'll run into each other in the elevator, they'll run into each other, and that creates what they call unity or consilience, Edmund Wilson talked about, and we'll get better government.
Well, let's hope so.
I think we will. I think we will.
Now,
But they're combined, and so that you have to talk about them together.
You're shortly heading back to China for teaching?
Yes, they got me scheduled for 4 weeks. When my wife came down and saw all the smoke in the basement, she said, well, this is good training for Beijing because of the pollution. She's a little concerned about the pollution because I've had any number of warnings. But I'm going to be, it'll be very interesting because I'll be talking about the American system of rule of law, comparing it to the Chinese system ruled by law. China is becoming a little less open and willing to accept some of the Western democratic ideas. So it'll be a chance for me to put the finger on the pulse of where China is with respect to its evolving form of government.
What do you think is the biggest threat to our democracy today?
Ooh, that's a tough question. I'm tempted to go back to what you said earlier, apathy, which may be fueled by cynicism. I mean, is that I'm not a big fan of these talking heads on the far right and the far left. They're very cynical, and they want to turn us off and want us to become disengaged. But if you want me to go to the crux, you know I am not a big fan of a recent United States Supreme Court case called Citizens United. It is a case that equated corporations with persons, and then it builds on U.S. Supreme Court jurisdiction cases that equate money with free speech. That is a very dangerous combination when you have corporations being able to put unlimited amount of money, do it anonymously, and I've seen it come into the elective process, and it distorts the elective process. And
We've seen that in recent
and that
elections.
gets to one of the other problems I see with our society. You know, my background is middle class, could be lower middle class when I'm growing up, whatever. But in the 50s, when I was growing up, a very optimistic time, in the 60s, you could look at Jefferson's statement, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and you could revisit pursuit of happiness, which comes from Aristotle and Plato, is that the role of government is to provide the maximum opportunity for the maximum number of people to achieve happiness. That means you have a safe society, national defense, fire and police. You have infrastructure, roads, so my dad could get his milk to the market so he could thrive economically. Education, for someone like me could get an education. Or like Justice Thomas on the United States Supreme Court, have access to education and do that. And I would even argue that it may expand to providing health. Now, how you provide health care, that's open for debate. Well, what's happening with the money coming in and the narrowing of the society, we are having a middle class which is atrophying.
It's being suffocated.
And that is it. So when we're talking about the greatest ills to society, they are interconnected. The way the political system works, the way money has an inordinate influence, how you elect people who then put in place policies that are suffocating the middle class, which is the bedrock of our society and its rule of law. It's a scary situation.
When you have 2% of the country earning over 50% of the money, the income, we really are on a road to disaster there. And I attribute a lot of it to greed. How much is enough? Why do you have to have more if you have more than enough for you and your family and your family's family in the future? What is this greed that's driving us forward to the detriment of the majority?
Now, I'm going to have a little fun with you here. But I mean, I don't know, I haven't had to describe myself politically for a couple of decades, but I'm comfortable describing my roots as an Eisenhower Republican. And actually, back at the time of Eisenhower, we determined what was enough. We had a very high tax rate over a certain level. That said, society said, yes, you are entitled to compensation at a very high level, but at a certain level, enough is enough, and we're going to tax it. And what that did is change society in the sense that it changed the nature of compensation for highly paid executives. There were perks, whatever, but they were perks that were kind of personal to that individual and didn't pass on from generation to generation. And also what it did is, you remember the Ford Foundation, all these different foundations, it set up an incentive to people who had a lot of wealth to figure out a way. I mean, the Ford Foundation and the Carnegie Foundation were set up a means by which Ford and Carnegie could control their wealth. I mean, they couldn't give it to their children, but they could control it into the future. But look at all the good that's come out of that. So what I'm saying is that here, social policy, tax policy, all of these things affect how society gets structured. And I think that our country has to, in a serious way, revisit some of these fundamental principles. Be an Eisenhower Republican, it wasn't all that bad.
Eisenhower wouldn't be a Republican today. Eisenhower would be drummed out of the Republican Party
That
today.
will be speculation, and I'll let you say that, and I'll
Even John McCain, who I look upon as very conservative, Mitch McConnell, who I look upon as even more conservative, are facing primaries from the ultra right wing of the Republican Party. And it's when people like Ted Cruz and people of that ilk get a position, I would put Rand Paul in there also, I think that they actually endanger the future of our democracy.
Now, what's interesting, Alan, is you describe McCain and Mitch McConnell as pretty far-right conservative Republicans. But if you look at their history, they've been driven that direction. I mean, the party has changed, and they have been. I mean, Mitch McConnell was a much more moderate person when he first started, and so it relates back to, there's DJ Tice did an editorial in the paper last Sunday about saying is that how the nature of the party and the party structure is driving its representatives, its leaders, and so both parties, I think, have some responsibility for the widening gap and polarization.
And when you combine that with the fact that people are not as well informed, not really that interested, don't read as much as they used to, are so involved in social media that they are forgetting the importance of really the ideals upon which this country was founded.
Well, and there's another thing to it. The more polarized we get, the more those in the center become cynical about the whole process and say, there's no way I can make a difference. It's all decided by, the extremists, one side or the other. And then they give up on democracy. That is a danger, giving up on the process.
And it's a real danger as I see it, as I see how this country has changed during my lifetime in that regard.
Hey, it's getting to be a long lifetime by now, isn't it, Alan?
It is.
Interesting times, though.
I look back and it's sometimes scary, but it's very interesting. We have less than a minute left.
And here's one of the things one of the things I'm facing after retiring from the court is the question that, because you're avoiding it because you're not retiring, but it's the question of what I'm going to do when I grow up. And I do want to leave on this note is that one of the things I want to do is to continue my involvement with young people, because I've found that.
That's why I teach.
They are a source of optimism. There are some very good young people out there. Now, we look back and we are maybe a little bit remorseful that things aren't the way they are. But we got to make sure that these young people, have the control to make things better.
Paul Anderson, always a great interview, always a pleasure sitting and talking with you, and thank you.
Always a pleasure, Alan.